Welcome to one of my favorite topics in evolutionary psychology, personality. Today we're going to explore a fascinating puzzle. Why are we all so different from one another? I think we all have an intuitive sense of what personality means. It refers to those stable, characteristic ways we relate to the world and perceive it. And here's something interesting. Your personality was probably pretty much locked in by mid to late adolescence. Some data even suggests it might solidify even earlier than that. Think about it. The person you were in high school, that's essentially the person you are today. I know, some of you might be cringing at that thought. Now here's where genetics comes in. About 50% of the variability between people and personality traits can be traced back to genetic factors. But let me be crystal clear about what this heritability figure means, because this is often misunderstood. It refers to differences between people in a population. It does not mean you got 50% of your personality from your parents, like you got 50% of their DNA. That's a common misconception. There used to be this huge controversy in psychology, the trait versus situation debate. Some behaviorists were so extreme they argued personality didn't even exist. They claimed it was all just reinforcement and punishment contingencies. According to them, you could turn anyone into an extrovert or introvert just by manipulating their environment. Thankfully, that view has largely been discarded. The evidence is pretty compelling that what we call personality remains fairly stable over time, at least from adolescence onward. Here's my favorite way to verify this. Go to your 10-year high school reunion. The jocks are still jocks. The extroverts are still chatting up everyone in the room. The quiet, thoughtful folks are still, well, being quiet and thoughtful. It's almost uncanny how much people stay the same. So today's journey will take us from understanding why these traits exist in the first place, to how evolution shaped them, and finally to how we can apply this knowledge to real-world situations. Let's dive in. Let's start with some fundamentals. The word personality has fascinating roots. It comes from the Greek word persona, which referred to the theatrical masks actors wore. But here's the beautiful irony. We use it to describe what's behind the mask, the real person beneath the surface. So what exactly are we talking about when we say personality? It's those stable, characteristic ways of relating to others and perceiving the world. And as I mentioned, it's mostly set by mid to late adolescence, though some intriguing research suggests it might crystallize even earlier, perhaps by first grade. Now, about that 50% heritability figure, let me hammer this home one more time because it's so commonly misunderstood in popular media. When we say personality traits are about 50% heritable, we're not saying that you're 50% nature and 50% nurture like some kind of genetic pie chart. What we're really saying is that in a given population, about half of the differences we observe between people can be attributed to genetic differences. It's about explaining variation, not dividing up an individual. Let me tell you about one of psychology's most heated debates, and this one was a real slugfest. The trait versus situation controversy basically asked, do people have stable personality traits they carry with them everywhere? Or are we more like chameleons, completely changing based on our situation? Some behaviorists took the extreme position that personality was essentially fiction, just a label we slapped on patterns of reinforcement and punishment. They literally believed you could make anyone act any way through the right contingencies. Want to turn a shy person into the life of the party. Just reinforce extroverted behavior enough. Well, that view didn't hold up. The data is now pretty conclusive. Traits win. What you were like in high school is probably what you'll be like for the rest of your life. Can personality change? Sure, a bit. But the core of who you are, that tends to be remarkably stable. Think about your own friend groups. You probably have that one friend who's always been the planner, the organizer. Another who's always been spontaneous and impulsive. Have they really changed fundamentally? Probably not. But here's what makes this so fascinating from an evolutionary perspective. If personality is so stable and so heritable, why? What evolutionary purpose does it serve? And why do we vary so much? Shouldn't natural selection have weeded out the suboptimal personalities? That's the puzzle we're going to crack today. Let me share some fascinating research that suggests personality stability might emerge even earlier than we thought, potentially from first grade. Imagine that. Your personality at age 6 might be a pretty good predictor of who you'll be at age 60. Now, I know what you're thinking. Really? First grade? I was eating paste and picking my nose in first grade. But the research suggests that beneath those charming childhood behaviors, there were already stable patterns of relating to the world emerging. Here's a fun way to really appreciate this stability. Think about your high school reunions. I mentioned this briefly before, but it's worth dwelling on because it's such a powerful demonstration. When you walk into that gymnasium or restaurant for your 10-year reunion, it's almost like stepping into a time machine. The people who were outgoing social butterflies at 17, still working the room at 27. The studious, conscientious kids, they're now the conscientious adults talking about their careers and 5-year plans. The class clowns, still cracking jokes. Now, I do have to acknowledge, and this is a bit dark, that sometimes the most troubled individuals from high school don't make it to these reunions. The extreme risk takers, those who struggled with substances, you might not see them there. It's a sobering reminder that while personality traits are descriptive, they can have serious consequences for life outcomes. But for most people, the stability is striking. It doesn't mean people can't grow, mature, or develop new skills. You can definitely become more skilled socially, more organized, or more emotionally regulated. But that underlying temperament, that core way of being in the world, it tends to persist. This raises some profound questions we'll explore. If our personalities are set so early and remain so stable, what does that mean for personal growth? For free will? For the changeability of human nature? Keep these questions in mind as we move forward. Now we arrive at one of the great puzzles in evolutionary psychology, and it's a genuinely challenging one. Here's the conundrum. If the mind is like the body, composed of evolved organs that are part of universal human nature, then why do our mental organs vary so much more than our physical organs? Think about it this way. Your liver doesn't vary that much from my liver. Sure, there are some differences in size, efficiency, maybe some genetic variants in enzyme production, but fundamentally livers are livers. Same with hearts, kidneys, lungs. Yes, there's variation, but it's relatively constrained. We all have the same basic design. But personality? Oh, that varies tremendously. Put two people side by side, and they might be radically different in how they approach the world, how they interact with others, how they handle stress. One person is gregarious and loves crowds. Another finds large social gatherings utterly exhausting. One person is spontaneous and flies by the seat of their pants. Another needs everything planned weeks in advance or they get anxious. So if we're all working with the same evolved psychological adaptations, the same mental organs, why is there so much variation in what we call personality? This is not a trivial question. It strikes at the heart of evolutionary psychology's claims about universal human nature. Here's another way to frame the puzzle. Natural selection is often portrayed as an optimizer that converges on the best solution. If being highly conscientious and agreeable leads to better outcomes, shouldn't evolution have pushed everyone toward maximum conscientiousness and agreeableness? Why do we still have people all across the spectrum? Some critics of evolutionary psychology jump on this and say, aha, this shows that evolutionary theory can't explain personality. It's all culturally constructed. But hold on, that's too quick. There are actually several sophisticated evolutionary explanations for maintained variation in personality traits. We're going to explore three main possibilities in the next few slides, and I think you'll find them quite elegant. The key insight is this: maybe there isn't one optimal personality type. Maybe variation itself is part of the design. Keep that possibility in mind. Before we dive into the specific mechanisms, let's step back and ask, why approach personality through an evolutionary lens at all? What does this framework buy us that traditional personality psychology doesn't? Here's the crucial distinction. Traditional psychology is largely descriptive. It tells us that there are 5 major personality dimensions, that they're stable over time, that they're partially heritable. That's all incredibly valuable, but it doesn't tell us why. It's like astronomy. Before Newton, we could describe how the planets moved, but we didn't understand the underlying forces. Evolutionary psychology aims to be explanatory. It asks, what were these traits designed to do? What adaptive problems were they solving? And here's the key question that will drive much of today's discussion. Personality traits have profound consequences for survival, mating success, offspring production, and parenting. So where do individual differences come from? The evolutionary approach gives us 3 major advantages. First, functional understanding. It reveals the adaptive problems each trait was designed to solve. For example, why does extroversion exist at all? The evolutionary answer: it facilitated social bonding and status acquisition in our ancestral environments. Suddenly, extroversion isn't just an abstract dimension on a questionnaire. It's a solution to specific social challenges our ancestors faced. Second, predictive power. Once we understand the function of a trait, we can generate testable predictions about how it should relate to fitness outcomes. For instance, if conscientiousness evolved for long-term planning and resource accumulation, then we should predict that highly conscientious individuals would be better at managing resources and planning for the future. And guess what? They are. Third, and this is crucial, it helps explain why individual variation persists. Traditional psychology can tell you that people vary. Evolutionary psychology can tell you why they vary. Why hasn't natural selection eliminated this variation and converged on a single optimal type? That's what we're about to explore. The evolutionary approach also forces us to think in terms of trade-offs. Every personality trait comes with costs and benefits. High extroversion might get you more social allies and mating opportunities, but it might also get you into more physical conflicts or expose you to more diseases. There's no free lunch in evolution. Every strategy has its downsides. So as we move forward, keep asking yourself, what problem was this trait solving? What are the costs and benefits? Under what conditions would this trait be advantageous versus disadvantageous? That's the evolutionary mindset. Now let's get to the meat of the matter. How does evolutionary theory explain the persistence of personality variation? I'm going to present three main mechanisms, and I want you to think critically about which ones you find most compelling. Mechanism 1, normal variation around an optimum. This is the simplest explanation. Maybe personality traits are just polygenic, influenced by many genes, and the variation we see is just like variation in height. Some people get a genetic shuffle that makes them tall, others get one that makes them short, and there's a normal distribution around some optimal middle point. Height varies, weight varies, so why shouldn't personality traits vary too? This explanation has some appeal, but it's perhaps the least satisfying from an evolutionary standpoint because it suggests the variation is somewhat random and non-adaptive. It's just noise in the system. Mechanism 2, frequency-dependent evolution. Now this is where it gets really interesting. This is the explanation most favored by evolutionary psychologists, and for good reason. The idea is that different personality types represent different strategies for achieving goals, and the success of each strategy depends on how common it is in the population. Here's a concrete example. Imagine a population where most people are trusting and cooperative. Basically, everyone's pretty gullible. In that environment, a gene for sociopathy, for taking advantage of others, might do very well. The sociopath can exploit all these trusting people. But here's the catch. As sociopaths become more common, people become more suspicious and guarded. Suddenly, the sociopathic strategy doesn't work as well anymore. The environment has changed. It's like a pendulum that swings back and forth, eventually settling at some equilibrium. And indeed, we find that about 2 to 4% of the population shows sociopathic traits, and this percentage is remarkably stable across different cultures. It's as if evolution has found a stable balance point. Or consider introversion versus extroversion. If most people in your environment are introverted and avoiding social interaction, being extroverted might give you a huge advantage. You're the one making all the connections and building the networks. But if everyone's an extrovert, competing for attention and status, maybe a more introverted, selective approach works better. By the way, did you know that the word gullible isn't even in the dictionary? Pretty interesting, right? Okay, it totally is in the dictionary. I was just demonstrating frequency-dependent selection in action. If most professors were constantly pulling pranks like that, you'd become suspicious and stop believing anything I say. But since most professors are relatively straightforward, occasional humor works. Facultative adaptations. This third mechanism is fascinating because it suggests that personality differences might not primarily be genetic at all. They might be developmental responses to early environment. These are called facultative adaptations, conditional strategies that get triggered by environmental cues. The classic example here is birth order effects. Oldest children tend to develop different personality profiles than middle or youngest children. Why? Perhaps because they're unconsciously detecting their family position and calibrating their strategy accordingly. As the firstborn, you might benefit from being more responsible and authority-aligned. As a later born, you might benefit from being more rebellious and seeking alternative niches. It's like a developmental switch gets flipped based on environmental input, and that shapes your personality trajectory for life. This would mean personality variation is maintained because different early environments adaptively trigger different personality configurations. So which mechanism is correct? Probably all three to varying degrees. Human personality is complex enough that multiple mechanisms likely contribute. But I think frequency-dependent selection is probably doing the heaviest lifting here. Let's dig deeper into one of the most provocative examples of frequency-dependent selection, psychopathy. Now, I want to be clear about terminology here. When we talk about psychopathy in an evolutionary context, we're not necessarily talking about violent criminals. We're talking about a cluster of personality traits that includes charm, manipulativeness, lack of empathy, and a willingness to exploit others. This is a great example of what evolutionary biologists call a morph, a distinct behavioral type maintained by frequency-dependent selection. The idea is that psychopathic traits can be advantageous, but only when they're relatively rare in the population. Here's how the logic works. In a population of mostly cooperative, trusting individuals, someone with psychopathic traits can do very well for themselves. They can charm people, gain their trust, extract resources, and move on without the emotional costs that would burden someone with normal empathy. They're essentially free riding on others' cooperativeness. But, and this is crucial, as psychopaths become more common, the strategy becomes less effective. People become more suspicious, more guarded, less willing to trust. The pool of easy marks dries up. Suddenly, being a psychopath in a population of suspicious people is much less advantageous. You might even be at a disadvantage because you lack the capacity for genuine cooperation that could help you in such an environment. The equilibrium frequency appears to be somewhere around 2 to 4% of the population showing significant psychopathic traits. That percentage is remarkably consistent across different cultures and societies, which suggests there might be some stable evolutionary equilibrium at work. Now, here's a thought-provoking question for you. Does understanding the evolutionary logic of psychopathy make it more or less morally condemnable? Some people worry that evolutionary explanations excuse bad behavior. Oh, I can't help being manipulative, it's in my genes. But I'd argue the opposite. Understanding the mechanism doesn't change the ethical status of the behavior. We can understand why psychopathy exists while still holding people accountable for their actions. Another question to ponder. In modern society, might psychopathic traits actually be more advantageous than they were ancestrally? Think about corporate environments, politics, high-stakes negotiations. Some have argued that modern institutions might inadvertently select for mild psychopathic traits. What do you think? The key insight here is that abnormal doesn't necessarily mean maladaptive in evolutionary terms. Sometimes the outliers are part of the design. Now let's turn to the most influential framework in modern personality research, the Big Five. You may have encountered this before, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what these dimensions actually measure. We can remember these 5 dimensions with the acronym OCEAN, and trust me, this acronym will save you on exam day. Openness to experience. This captures your intellect, imagination, curiosity, and creativity. High scores love novel experiences, abstract thinking, and artistic expression. They're the ones who want to try exotic foods, visit unusual places, and engage with complex ideas. Low scorers tend to prefer the familiar and concrete. They're more traditional and practical in their thinking. Conscientiousness. This is all about order, duty, deliberation, and self-discipline. Highly conscientious people are organized, punctual, goal-oriented, and reliable. They're the ones with color-coded calendars and 5-year plans. Low scorers are more spontaneous, flexible, and let's be honest, sometimes a bit chaotic. They're not lazy, they just don't feel the need to plan everything down to the minute. Extroversion, this dimension captures sociability, assertiveness, activity level, and positive emotions. Extroverts get energized by social interaction. They love parties, they're talkative, they're often the center of attention. Introverts, on the other hand, find social interaction draining, even if they enjoy it. They need alone time to recharge. And contrary to popular belief, introversion is not the same as shyness. Agreeableness. This measures trust, nurturance, kindness, and cooperation. Highly agreeable people are warm, sympathetic, and concerned with social harmony. They hate conflict and will often go out of their way to help others. Low scorers are more competitive, skeptical, and willing to prioritize their own interests. They're not necessarily mean, just less concerned with being liked. Neuroticism. This captures anxiety, depression, moodiness, and vulnerability to stress. Now, neuroticism is not a very flattering term, is it? Some researchers prefer to flip it and call the opposite end emotional stability. High scorers on neuroticism experience more negative emotions and are more reactive to stress. Low scorers are calm, even-tempered, and resilient. Here's what's remarkable about the Big Five. These dimensions emerge consistently across different cultures, different languages, different methods of assessment. Whether researchers use self-reports, peer ratings, or behavioral observations, these 5 factors keep appearing. This cross-cultural consistency suggests we're tapping into something real and fundamental about human nature. The Big Five captures the majority of personality variance, meaning if you know someone's scores on these 5 dimensions, you can predict a lot about their behavior, their career success, their relationship patterns, even their health outcomes. But here's the million-dollar question: why these 5? Why not 4 or 6 or 7? And what's the evolutionary logic behind each dimension? That's what we're going to explore in detail. Now, some researchers have suggested we should actually be talking about the Big Six, not the Big Five. The 6th trait they want to add: general intelligence, or the G factor. This is represented by the new acronym GO case. Let's break that down. G equals sign, general intelligence. O equals sign, openness. C equals sign, conscientiousness. A equals sign, agreeableness. S equals sign, stability, the positive end of neuroticism. E equals sign, extroversion. Now this raises an interesting question. Should we consider intelligence a personality trait? That's actually pretty controversial. Traditional personality psychology has typically kept intelligence separate. It's an ability, not a trait, right? You're not conscientious at something. Conscientiousness is about how you approach things, but intelligence is about how well you can solve problems. On the other hand, there are some good arguments for including intelligence in our personality framework. First, intelligence is stable over time, just like personality traits. Your IQ at age 10 predicts your IQ at age 40 pretty well. Second, intelligence is partially heritable like personality traits, about 50 to 80% depending on the study and age group. Third, intelligence has predictive validity for life outcomes in ways similar to personality traits. And perhaps most importantly, from an evolutionary perspective, intelligence, like the other Big Five traits, shows substantial variation in the population, has clear fitness consequences, and presumably has an evolutionary history. If we're asking why do people differ in conscientiousness, we should probably also ask why do people differ in intelligence? The Go case model is particularly popular among evolutionary psychologists because it provides a more complete picture of individual differences. When you're trying to predict someone's mating success, career achievement, or parental investment, knowing their intelligence gives you additional predictive power beyond the Big Five alone. Here's a fun fact: general intelligence actually correlates moderately with openness. Makes sense, right? Both involve cognitive engagement with complexity. But they're not the same thing. You can be highly intelligent, but not particularly open to new experiences, or vice versa. So while the Big Five remains the dominant framework, the Big Six has its adherents, especially in evolutionary circles. For our purposes today, we'll mostly focus on the traditional Big Five, but keep in mind that intelligence is lurking in the background as a potential 6th dimension. And speaking of which, how many of you have noticed that psychologists are terrible at naming things? Neuroticism. Really? That's the best we could do? At least Go Case is catchier than Ocean. Here is a fun rap song by the rapper Baba Brinkman, who's into evolutionary psychology. He wrote a rap song about the Big Six. If you would like, go ahead and take a listen to that. Copy the web link into another web browser tab or window. Return here when you have watched the video, and the next slide in this presentation will appear in a few seconds. Now we're going to take a deep dive into the evolutionary logic of each Big Five trait. For each dimension, I want you to think about 3 things. What adaptive problem did this trait solve? What are the fitness benefits? And what are the costs and trade-offs? Extroversion. Let's start with extroversion. The core features are sociability, assertiveness, and enthusiasm for social interaction. From an evolutionary perspective, what would this be good for? The answer: facilitating social bonding, status seeking, and mating opportunities. Humans are an intensely social species. For our ancestors, being embedded in social networks could mean the difference between survival and death. Extroverts would have been better at building alliances, gaining social status, and, crucially, attracting mates. The fitness benefits are substantial. Studies show higher short-term mating success for extroverts. They're better at approaching potential partners, they're more visible in social environments, and their confidence is attractive. Extroverts also tend to achieve higher social status in groups, which historically would have translated to better access to resources. But here's where it gets interesting: the trade-offs and costs. Extroverts face higher physical risks from social conflicts. Being assertive and socially aggressive can lead to violence. They also face increased vulnerability to violence and higher disease exposure through social contact. Every handshake, every party, every crowd is an opportunity for pathogen transmission. There's even a molecular basis to some of this. The DRD47R allele, which is linked to novelty seeking and extroversion, is found at higher frequencies in historically migratory populations. This makes sense. The people who were willing to pack up and move to new territories were probably the extroverted, novelty-seeking types. Neuroticism. Now let's tackle neuroticism, or as I prefer to think of it, threat sensitivity. The core features are emotional instability, anxiety, and sensitivity to threats. The evolutionary function enhancing vigilance to threats and dangers. In a dangerous ancestral environment, predators, hostile neighboring groups, environmental hazards, being anxious and vigilant could literally save your life. The fitness benefits, enhanced threat detection is valuable. Studies show that intermediate levels of neuroticism can actually boost fertility in some contexts, perhaps because a moderate level of caution leads to better risk management. But the costs are severe: chronic psychological stress, reduced well-being and life satisfaction, and impaired ability to form and maintain social relationships. High neuroticism is associated with shorter lifespan and worse health outcomes. Here's the key insight. Neuroticism is highly context dependent. Vigilance is adaptive in high-threat environments, but costly in safe ones. If you live in a dangerous neighborhood or a war zone, being anxious and hypervigilant might serve you well. But if you live in a safe suburban environment, that same level of anxiety is just draining and counterproductive. This explains why neuroticism persists in the population despite its costs. It's not universally bad. In the right environment, it's adaptive. In the wrong environment, it's debilitating. Natural selection can't eliminate it because the right level depends on your environment. Think about this. Are we creating mismatches in modern society? We have people with high threat sensitivity living in objectively safe environments, leading to anxiety disorders. Conversely, we might have people with low threat sensitivity engaging in genuinely risky behaviors. Understanding the evolutionary function helps us see these as calibration issues, not character flaws. Let's continue our evolutionary tour of the Big Five with conscientiousness and agreeableness. Conscientiousness encompasses goal-directed behavior, planning, organization, and self-discipline. These are the people who actually use their planners, show up on time, and finish what they start. The evolutionary function is clear, promoting long-term investment, foraging efficiency, and resource accumulation. Our ancestors who could delay gratification, plan ahead, and organize their efforts would have been more successful at almost everything, from storing food for winter to raising children to building social capital. The fitness benefits are impressive. Studies show higher fertility in men and better health outcomes across the board. Conscientious people achieve greater occupational success and resource acquisition. They literally accumulate more stuff because they're better at planning and working toward goals. And they provide better offspring care through organized parenting. They're the ones who remember to pack snacks, schedule doctor's appointments, and create bedtime routines. The behavioral pathway makes sense. Conscientious people spend more time in productive work, which leads to more resources, which leads to better fitness outcomes. Simple and elegant. But what about the costs? Every trait has downsides. For conscientiousness, the costs include missing short-term opportunities due to rigid planning. Sometimes the best opportunities are spontaneous. There's also reduced flexibility in rapidly changing environments. If your environment is unpredictable, having a rigid plan might be worse than being adaptable. And excessive caution can limit exploration. Sometimes you need to take risks and try new things. Agreeableness. Agreeableness covers cooperation, altruism, empathy, and the tendency towards social harmony. These are the people who genuinely care about getting along with others. The evolutionary function, facilitating cooperation, social bonds, and reciprocal exchange for group cohesion. Humans survived through cooperation. We needed to work together to hunt large game, defend against threats, and raise children. Agreeable people would have been preferred coalition partners. The fitness benefits include enhanced alliance formation and group cohesion. Studies show prosociality is linked to offspring survivorship, probably because agreeable people receive more social support and can better navigate communal child-rearing. Agreeableness also facilitates long-term relationship maintenance, which is crucial for successful pair bonding and parenting. But here's the dark side. Agreeable people are vulnerable to exploitation by social defectors. If you're always cooperative and trusting, sociopaths will take advantage of you. Agreeableness also leads to reduced success in zero-sum contests where someone has to lose. And it makes it difficult to establish dominance in hierarchies, hard to climb the corporate ladder if you're too nice. There's an interesting sex difference here. Women score higher on agreeableness globally. Why? Possibly due to evolutionary pressures from childcare, being agreeable and empathetic is crucial for successfully raising vulnerable children. There's also evidence that women face stronger selection for conflict avoidance, perhaps because physical conflict was more costly for them. The key insight from both these traits: there's no universal optimum. Whether high conscientiousness or agreeableness is better depends entirely on your environment, your goals, and what strategies others around you are pursuing. In a cooperative, stable environment, conscientiousness and agreeableness are fantastic. In a competitive, chaotic environment, maybe not so much. Let's complete our evolutionary tour with openness and then integrate what we've learned. Openness captures creativity, curiosity, and appreciation for novelty. These are the artists, the innovators, the people who want to try everything at least once. The evolutionary function: enhancing exploration and creativity, aiding in the discovery of new resources or mates. This trait would be particularly valuable in changing or novel environments where traditional approaches might not work. Openness represents cognitive flexibility, the ability to think outside the box. The fitness benefits are fascinating. Creative intelligence is attractive to mates. There's good evidence that artistic and creative abilities function as courtship displays. They signal cognitive capacity and good genes. Openness also facilitates cultural innovation and adaptation. Those open individuals were probably the ones inventing new tools, discovering new food sources, and creating new social practices. And openness provides cognitive flexibility and problem solving, which is valuable when you encounter novel challenges. But the costs are real. When individuals consistently deviate from social norms, it may sometimes lead to reduced acceptance within a group. Unpredictability may harm relationships. People might not trust you if you're too erratic. And there are costs of failed exploration. Not every novel idea works. Sometimes the traditional way is traditional because it actually works. So what have we learned? Here are the key insights. First, traits represent trade-offs. None of the big five dimensions are universally good or bad. Each comes with benefits and costs. High extroversion brings social success but also social risks. High conscientiousness brings goal achievement but also rigidity, and so on. Second, optimal trait levels are context dependent. The best personality depends on your environment, your goals, and what others around you are doing. In a dangerous environment, neuroticism is adaptive. In a safe environment, it's costly. In a competitive environment, low agreeableness might help. In a cooperative environment, it might hurt. Third, trait combinations create diverse strategic profiles. You're not just high or low on each trait independently, you're a unique combination. A person who's high in openness and conscientiousness is different from someone who's high in openness but low in conscientiousness. The first might be a successful creative professional. The second might be a starving artist. Some researchers have proposed alternative models like the Big Two: prosociality, combining agreeableness and emotional stability, and industriousness, combining conscientiousness and intellect. This simpler model captures broad life strategies. Are you focused on getting along with others or getting ahead through your own efforts? The big picture: personality variation is maintained because different strategies work in different contexts, and because the success of each strategy depends on how common it is. There's no single optimal human personality, just as there's no single optimal animal behavior. Evolution maintains diversity because diversity is adaptive at the population level. I want to highlight the work of Daniel Nettle, who has done some of the most elegant research on the evolutionary psychology of personality. His key insight is what's called the cost-benefit trade-off framework. Nettle's central argument is beautifully simple. Traits are rarely universally good or bad. Instead, each personality trait dimension carries both fitness benefits and costs. And crucially, environmental variability maintains personality diversity because different environments favor different trait levels. Let me show you Nettle's cost-benefit analysis for each of the big five. Extroversion. Benefits include mating success and social allies. You're more visible, more connected, more attractive. But the costs include physical risks and conflict. Extroverts get into more fights, more accidents, more dangerous situations. Neuroticism. Benefits include vigilance and threat detection. You notice dangers others miss. but the costs include stress and poor health. Chronic anxiety takes a toll on your body and mind. Conscientiousness. Benefits include goal achievement and effective planning. You get stuff done. But the costs include rigidity and missed opportunities. Sometimes you need to be flexible and spontaneous. Agreeableness. Benefits include cooperation and strong social bonds. People like you and want to help you. But the costs include vulnerability to exploitation. Nice people finish last, as the saying goes. Openness. Benefits include creativity and access to new resources. You're innovative and adaptable. But the costs include social nonconformity and risk. Being weird can get you ostracized, and novel ideas often fail. This framework is powerful because it explains several puzzles simultaneously. First, it explains why variation persists. If every trait has both benefits and costs, then there's no single optimal value. The best level depends on your specific environment and circumstances. Second, it explains why traits are moderately heritable but not completely heritable. If optima shift with environments, we'd expect genetic variation to be maintained. Third, it generates testable predictions. If extroversion benefits mating but costs survival, we should see extroverts having more sexual partners but also more accidents. And we do. Nettle's work has been hugely influential because it provides a clear, testable framework for understanding personality from an evolutionary perspective. It moves us beyond just so stories to rigorous quantitative predictions about personality fitness relationships. The key takeaway: when you're evaluating someone's personality, including your own, don't think in terms of good traits versus bad traits. Think in terms of trade-offs. Every personality configuration is a different bet on what strategy will pay off in your particular environment. Now I want to share some really fascinating recent research that beautifully illustrates how evolutionary thinking can generate novel predictions about personality. This work examines the relationship between pathogen prevalence and personality traits. Here's the logic. In environments with high parasite prevalence, lots of infectious diseases circulating, you're more likely to catch diseases from other people, especially from strangers who might carry novel pathogens your immune system hasn't encountered. So what would be an adaptive response? The answer: greater xenophobia and fear of strangers. This leads to more introversion. You avoid social contact, especially with out-group members. There's also more focus on in-group versus out-group distinctions. You trust your family and close friends but are suspicious of outsiders. And crucially, there's less openness, less interest in new ideas, new places, and new experiences because novelty often means contact with unfamiliar people and places. This is sometimes called the germ theory of conservatism, and it's generated a lot of interesting research. Studies have found that regions with higher historical pathogen prevalence show lower average levels of extroversion and openness, greater social conservatism and political conservatism, stronger in-group favoritism and out-group prejudice, more traditional values and resistance to social change. Now, this doesn't mean that conservatives are paranoid or that liberals are reckless. It's more subtle than that. The idea is that pathogen stress during development might calibrate your personality to be more cautious and tradition-oriented, which would have been adaptive in high-disease environments. Think about it from a behavioral immune system perspective. If diseases are everywhere, avoiding novel social contacts and sticking with familiar people and practices is a reasonable strategy. You reduce your exposure to pathogens. But if you live in a low pathogen environment, that same strategy is overly cautious. You miss out on the benefits of openness and social connection without gaining much in terms of disease avoidance. This is a beautiful example of how personality might be facultatively adjusted based on environmental cues. It's not that genes for introversion are more common in high pathogen areas, it's that the same developmental mechanisms respond to pathogen cues by producing more introverted phenotypes. Here's a thought-provoking question. In our modern world, with advanced medicine and sanitation, are we creating a mismatch? People who grew up in environments with high pathogen stress might maintain that cautious, closed personality even when they move to safe, low pathogen environments. Could this explain some cultural conflicts in diverse societies? Another implication: this might help explain why political attitudes often cluster together. Why do social conservatism, traditional values, and xenophobia tend to go together? Maybe they're all part of a coordinated pathogen avoidance strategy that gets activated together. This research is still developing, and there are definitely critiques and debates about it. But it's a great example of how evolutionary thinking can generate non-obvious, testable predictions about personality. You won't believe this, but Baba Brinkman, our evolutionary psychology rapper, has a song about this too. It's called There Ain't No Bugs on Me, and it tackles the relationship between pathogen prevalence and personality traits. Only in evolutionary psychology would you find rap songs about parasites and politics. Let me share some of the key lyrics because they're genuinely insightful. For instance, why is Darwinism such a toxic proposition for conservative religions but not for liberal religions like Episcopalianism? See, it's not the religion, it's the conservatism. So what's the difference between conservatives and liberals? He continues, moral psychologists have a definition that's simple. Liberals, like myself, are just higher in a stable personality trait known as openness to experience. We think novelty is great. New people, new places, new types of food, new lovers whenever someone inspires the mood. Then comes the evolutionary punchline, and it might seem like this life is a dream, but novelty is the place where parasites breed, which gives us a delicious little testable prediction for the scientific method to consider, namely, that openness to experience in liberalism should be influenced by microorganisms in your environment. Does the evidence agree? Man, you wouldn't believe how much your political leanings can be predicted by the local threat of infectious disease. This is both funny and scientifically accurate. The research really does show that pathogen prevalence predicts personality and political orientation. It's one of those findings that sounds too weird to be true but actually holds up empirically. Brinkman goes on. So let's celebrate every universal of humanness, like the fact that conservatism is an immune defense, where the brain gets a signal from the lymphatic system that says, be afraid of anything that's dramatically different. Now, I want to be careful here. This research doesn't mean that conservatism is just a disease avoidance mechanism, or that liberals are right and conservatives are wrong. The point is more subtle. Our brains have evolved mechanisms that calibrate our personality based on environmental cues, and pathogen prevalence is one of those cues. In a high pathogen environment, being cautious, traditional, and suspicious of novelty is genuinely adaptive. It keeps you alive. In a low pathogen environment, being open, curious, and willing to engage with diversity is adaptive. It allows you to learn new things and form broader coalitions. Neither strategy is inherently better, they're adapted to different environmental conditions. The problem arises when you have a strategy calibrated for one environment, but you're actually living in a different environment. That's what we call an evolutionary mismatch. Here's a final thought. In our modern, globalized world with rapid cultural change, we have people with different pathogen-calibrated strategies all living together. Understanding the evolutionary roots of these differences might help us bridge political divides. Instead of seeing the other side as irrational or immoral, we can see them as having a different but evolutionarily explicable response to environmental challenges. And yes, you can learn all this from a rap song. If you would like to listen to the song, copy the web link into another web browser tab or window and pause this video. When you restart this video, it will advance to the next slide in this presentation after a few seconds. All right, let's bring this all home. We've covered a lot of theory today, but evolutionary psychology isn't just an academic exercise. It has real-world applications that can change how we understand ourselves and organize our societies. Workplace diversity. Think about team composition in the workplace. Traditional HR might just hire the best people without thinking about personality diversity. But an evolutionary perspective suggests that different personalities fill complementary adaptive niches. You want some extroverts for networking and sales, some introverts for deep analytical work. You want some highly conscientious people for organization and follow-through, and some less conscientious people who can pivot quickly and improvise. Team personality differences reflects frequency-dependent selection in action. Just like in evolution, the optimal mix depends on the task environment. Relationship compatibility. Understanding evolutionary trade-offs can also inform relationship choices. Sometimes compatibility comes from complementary traits. An agreeable person might pair well with someone less agreeable because they balance each other out. Mental health, this is huge. Modern environments often mismatch with evolved traits. Someone with high neuroticism might have been perfectly adapted to a dangerous ancestral environment, but in modern suburban safety, that same vigilance becomes clinical anxiety. Understanding the evolutionary function of traits helps us create better interventions. Instead of seeing anxiety as purely pathological, we can see it as a mismatch between evolved threat detection mechanisms and current environment. This changes how we approach treatment. Evolutionary mismatch. Speaking of mismatch, this is one of the most important concepts for understanding modern problems. Many of our psychological traits evolved for environments radically different from those we inhabit today. High openness might have been risky in a tribal environment, but is almost required in modern creative economies. Low agreeableness might have been costly in small hunter-gatherer bands, but could be advantageous in anonymous urban environments. Critical questions to ponder. Let me leave you with some thought-provoking questions. First, are some personalities adaptively better than others? The evolutionary answer is no, it's all context dependent. But does that mean we can't make value judgments? How do we balance evolutionary understanding with moral and ethical frameworks? Second, how do we address evolutionary mismatches? If someone's personality is adapted for an environment they no longer live in, what should they do? Change their environment, change their personality? Learn compensatory strategies? Third, what are the political and social implications of this research? If personality differences have evolutionary roots, does that mean they're unchangeable? Does it excuse behavior we might otherwise condemn? How do we use this knowledge responsibly? The field continues to evolve. I want to end by emphasizing that evolutionary psychology offers a nuanced view of personality. It's not about genetic determinism. We've discussed plasticity, facultative adaptations, and context dependency throughout this lecture. The field is increasingly focused on gene-environment interactions, developmental plasticity, and how personality expresses itself across diverse cultural contexts. The future of this field will involve much more sophisticated models that integrate genetics, development, culture, and environment. We're just scratching the surface of understanding how evolution shaped the incredible differences in human personalities. So as we leave this presentation today, I want you to think about your own personality through an evolutionary lens. What adaptive problems might your traits be solving? What are the costs and benefits of your personality configuration? And how might your traits interact with your current environment in ways that are adaptive or maladaptive? Remember, there's no optimal personality, no best way to be human. Evolution has created personality traits that can vary in facultative or frequency-dependent ways that were likely adaptive in ancestral social environments and may still be adaptive in today's social environments. Your personality is part of a tapestry of human variation. Embrace it, understand it, and use that understanding to navigate your world more effectively. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.